What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to Chel Chit Chat. I'm Lyss Houde, your host as always, and we once again have another banger of an episode lined up for you on this beautiful day. For episode 6, I am going to be joined by Manitoba's own Jordy Zacharias. Jordy is a former Division I and U Sport hockey player who, since finishing her player career, has stayed involved in the hockey space now as a mental health counselor and a junior hockey coach. Jordy is an assistant coach with the Winnipeg Monarchs. If you're not familiar with the kind of Canadian junior hockey system, this is a Manitoba Junior Hockey League team, an MJHL team. So it's mostly young boys in kind of their late teens, similar ages to like the Canadian Hockey League, the WHL, OHL, QMJHL, and lots of provinces kind of have their own iterations of this league. So Jordy coaches here in Winnipeg. Through her involvement with the Winnipeg Monarchs, I've had the privilege of getting to know Jordy. And I'm really excited for her to come on today and talk a little bit about her experience, not just as a player, but also now working with players and how those different experiences, as well as her education background, help her shape today's athletes and their perception of what it means to be a high-performance athlete. This episode is really interesting for me to record because while I am not a high-performance athlete, as I'm sure you all know, I do consider myself to be a relatively high-performance person. I am very much driven by productivity and, being highly motivated, wanting to do work kind of all of the time. So I think a lot of the considerations and perspectives that she brings up in this episode are super important schools of thought for us as we think about not just high-performance athletes, but then also ourselves as we kind of exist in this space that includes so many intersections of different high-performance people. As always, I'm so glad that you're here for this episode because it was made just for you as you navigate your journey of growing in hockey. Welcome back to Chel Chit Chat, everyone. I am super excited about today's guest because we have a little bit of a personal relationship through some of my involvement with some junior hockey volunteering that I've been doing this year. And Jordy has like the coolest resume ever when it comes to hockey, not just here in Manitoba, but on a larger scale as well. So I think we're going to have a ton of fun today. So Jordy, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Good. I'm really excited as well because I think this is going to be such an interesting conversation because I feel like you've had so many different touch points with this sport as an athlete, as a coach, as someone who works in and around it in a lot of different ways. Couple of cool milestones in terms of your coaching career in particular and stuff like that. So we're just going to go through all of it today and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of dealing with high performance athletes and some of the different changes we're seeing in the space, especially around the mental health side and how we're making improvements and innovations kind of in that area. So maybe just to get started, why don't you tell everyone a little bit kind of about yourself, a bit of a background, a bit of the coolest notes on Jordy Zacharias.
Yeah, totally. I think my first mind always just goes to where I started playing hockey. Obviously, there's a lot more about me than that, but it was always such a big piece in every phase of my life. But yeah, I grew up here in Winnipeg, big hockey family. My dad played. My mom was more ringette back then. Hockey wasn't so big for females, but my uncle played in the Western League. He played overseas. My grandpa was on the Riels board in the for years. So I think it was bound to happen, and by 3 I was on skates and already going, and I had an older brother that was starting to play a couple of years ahead of me, so I just kind of jumped right in and probably didn't have much of a choice, but I enjoyed it no matter what, so it was good. I at the time, this wasn't like it was decades ago, but starting to feel that way where, yeah, female hockey was just growing. There wasn't a ton of all-female teams when I was younger. Obviously, when you're in Timbits, it's all the same. But I continued to play boys until I was in high school. So I played through like our AA programs, and then I played female spring hockey. And then kind of as I got to grade 9, started touching the puck a little bit less. The guys were then now much taller than I was. So I flipped over and at that time, St. Mary's was just actually starting their prep academy. I know they just recently had to end their program, but this was when it was just beginning, and Annie Chipman was on the team, and they kind of came together, Larry Bumstead, and they, within True North, I guess, overall, formed the prep team. So a group of my friends from spring, we went over to St. Mary's, and I played there for 3 years. And at the end of my grade 11 year, I'd committed to play at the University of Connecticut, so I had a scholarship opportunity to play Division I. And at that point in grade 11, I was starting to toy with still being really close with my high school friends, or like friends that I grew up with outside of St. Mary's, and not just the guys, but a lot of the girls too that I knew from my area. So in grade 12, I went to Fort Richmond Collegiate, and I got to play high school hockey with a lot of my girlfriends that I never really had an opportunity to play with when I was younger. And then I played with the Winnipeg Avros. So I did a year there in grade 12. So it was an interesting kind of change from one to the other. Now I feel like there is a lot of similarities in some ways. At that time, the AAA system was just starting to get really strong and attend a lot of the same tournaments and showcases that we were with St. Mary's. So it was a good shift. But yeah, then I went to play at the University of Connecticut. At this point, I always thought I was going to be going into like a physiotherapy or being a teacher was something I wanted to do for a long time. And then as I got over there and started and even just going through the whole recruitment process too, and seeing this whole other side of sport and kind of the mental component and how taxing that can be at times, I really struggled. I was doing really well when it came to hockey at UConn. So I don't think a lot of people saw it, thinking it wasn't impacting my play. I was doing pretty good in school too, but I was really struggling being far away from home, and kind of knew in my gut that maybe it wasn't the best place for me to be, even though it was a very cool place to be overall. It's exactly what you would think. So I transferred back to U of M, and I was fortunate enough to have John Rempel kind of allow me to practice with the team and see if it would be a good fit moving forward. And then the rest was kind of history there. I played 4 years. We won a national championship in my third year, the program's first ever. And then I was on the leadership team as an assistant captain and captain in my final 2 years. So kind of jumped around a little bit here and there, but I always kind of just stuck to the idea of trust your gut, and if it's not something that feels right for you at that time, then follow whatever your gut's telling you to do. So I have a lot of gratitude to the Bison program and John specifically for bringing me back and giving me that opportunity. So I was fortunate enough after there. It was a whole kind of everything went downhill in some ways. I graduated in 2020. I stopped playing hockey in 2020, and then everything just came to a halt. I was working at the rink training center at the time. So when the pandemic hit, I was trying to figure out what my next move was. I knew that I wanted to eventually do my master's in counseling. I needed to take a few prereq courses, kind of still toying with the idea, do I want to continue playing? So as the spring went on, I got an email from the PWHPA with Jana Hefford, and they were reaching out to U Sport and NCAA grads to see if there'd be any interest in joining kind of that takeover kind of tour that they have with the PWHPA, where they were starting to try and form this league, competing with the PHF a little bit. And I said, you know what, why not? I got nothing better going on right now. Why don't I go for it and see kind of what happens? So I trained really hard all summer with the rink and went to a camp in Calgary in September. And it was a great experience being able to share the ice with some legendary players like Megan Mickelson, Brianna Decker, Blair Turnbull, Rebecca Johnston, lots of really big names. And, we can definitely get into that with the high performance side of things. Some of the things that I would notice with those types of athletes. And so, yeah, did a little bit there. COVID kind of ruined it, and being able to really compete, but was proud that I went for it and made that team, even though I didn't really get an opportunity to play. It's kind of something that I wanted to strive for. So since then, I've been coaching 2 years. I was an assistant with the Bisons, and then I was the interim head the last 2 years, and here I am in the MJHL.
Yeah, and you're, I think, one of, if not the first bench bosses in the MJ right now, right?
As a female?
Yes.
I think so. Yeah, I don't know that there's been any female bench coaches in the league. I know some people have maybe helped out in other capacities, but from my understanding, yeah. And I was fortunate. Zach and I, Franco, have been friends for a long time. We worked at Mini U together when we were both playing for the Bisons, and
Too cool.
through kind of mutual connections, we've stayed in touch over the years. So it's been a nice fit with our staff. We all get along really, really well.
Yeah, it's awesome. I feel like there's so many different levels of kind of the beginning to where we're at now. There's so many layers, so many things that we're going to kind of touch on over the course of the episode. But I think the thing that, you said it best, it always feels a little bit strange at the beginning being like, well, when I was growing up, because we're not that old, but like I even think of my own experience where, I coached hockey last year and my local hockey association, and they had girls teams in this year for, U7, U9, U11, U13, U15. When I was growing up, less than 10 years ago, in that same hockey association, there were zero, right? So it's like the change really has been that drastic in that last little stretch, and it's been really cool to kind of watch it, be a part of it in a lot of different ways, I'm sure, kind of for both of us. So tell us a little bit about kind of what it was like playing at the U Sport level, whether it's the Div 1 part with UConn or also here, kind of what that experience is like going from playing as more of a youth into more of an adult, and what the transition was like from playing high performance here kind of locally in Manitoba versus, going to the highest level that was possible in North America at that kind of point.
Yeah, totally. And it's honestly kind of difficult to pinpoint when I felt hockey really started to become serious, right? In that aspect of being elite, or at that level. And I guess St. Mary's was probably that. And I think realistically, it was the financial aspect of it, for my parents, right? And committing that and sacrificing that is when you start to feel a little bit more pressure, of course, but you see that shift. And then, again, when you get to the university level, especially, at a place like UConn, when you're on a scholarship, you feel a sense of, I have to perform well, right, to be able to maintain the scholarship essentially. And then you get to that point where everyone's in the same boat too, right? Everyone's there for a reason. We've kind of funneled and narrowed that down. The one thing that I loved about U of M and coming back, and I was always really curious what the differences were going to be. And I found at UConn there was such a high level of individual skill, in a lot of ways, and U Sport was a bit different, especially Canada West. It was fast, it was competitive in terms of kind of like really grindy. Like you wear teams down. Everyone's very structured in a lot of ways when I played, and yeah, so maybe you don't have as much of that overwhelming individual skill, but it was very much kind of a blue collar type of league in the best way. And the one thing that always really stuck out to me was what everyone was doing outside of hockey too, because at U Sport, you can't rely on having a full scholarship to cover all of your expenses like you could potentially with NCAA Division One. So a lot of my teammates were working on the side, and they'd do a full course load, they'd play hockey, and they'd have a part-time job throughout the year to pay their rent or whatever that might be. And so I think especially the team that we had that won a national championship, like there was just such a deep sense of work ethic. Not saying that other teams don't or that it didn't have that at UConn too. It was just something that really stuck out to me with the group that we had, at least.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that especially in the women's hockey circuit, like I know for men's hockey in particular, there's a little bit more of a stark discrepancy between U Sport and the kind of Can West stretch versus NCAA Division One, where for men's hockey it tends to be a little bit more of a direct pipeline to the NHL, but that whole idea of direct pipeline to playing pro women's hockey at the level where you make millions and millions wasn't really a thing, before these last couple of years and stuff. So that's a really interesting observation. I think that that would be a really interesting, situation to be in, and an observation to make as you're kind of going through and seeing the strengths and what's appealing about the different avenues that you can pursue if you were to kind of want to take that next step as an athlete. But I want to know, what were some of the more, obviously playing your full years of eligibility, there's highs, lows. You mentioned the national championship that you won with the Bisons and everything, some great experiences, I'm sure, and probably some tough ones as well. What were kind of some of the biggest highlights, and also maybe some of the lowest lowlights, if you will, about kind of that playing experience, and some of the, whether it's the harsh transition of moving away from home to another country, or making the decision to switch teams and all this sort of stuff? What were some of the kind of big outlier moments of these amazing experiences versus some of the more difficult ones as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the amazing ones were usually what came after some really hard times too. And even before I was in university, trying out for Team Manitoba at the provincial level and not even making it to top 40 my first year when everyone else did. And you face some things like that, and you're like, okay, I got two kind of options on what I want to do. I can use it as fuel essentially, or I can just admit defeat and kind of pack it in from there. And so that was kind of my first point of like, okay, this is what I really want to do and what I really want to work for. And then same thing, yeah, getting my scholarship. And I'd say that was, yeah, probably the lowest of lows was being just like not feeling like myself over there. And it's hard because, my parents spent a lot and invested a lot in me to have this opportunity so that they didn't have to, pay for university. And a Division 1 school, you have so many amazing resources and everything that you could ever ask. And I think that's such a big piece when it comes to mental health too, is that on the outside it can seem like you have it all, but on the inside that might not always be how you're feeling. And so there was definitely a sense of, what will people think if I leave? Lots of, yeah, worry about kind of the outside noise. And I was kind of at the point where if I never play hockey again, that's okay, because who I am matters more, and living into that mattered way more to me. And being in such a dark place that, it's not that I never wanted to end my life, but I considered trying to injure myself so that I could go home in certain ways, and just trying to find ways like that. And that's when I kind of knew, what, this is not a good position for me to be in. But again, it's just one thing that I've always learned, whether as an athlete or now as a coach, that door closed and then this wonderful new door opened with U of M that I could never have imagined. And even through there, I knew that, leading up to our national championship, there was years of heartbreak with that team, and, making it to the CanWest finals, but then not being able to go to nationals because a CanWest team was hosting. So only the winner of CanWest would get to go, where typically two teams do, right? So they fell in that 2 years in a row where they didn't get to qualify, even though they made it to CanWest finals. And then in my second year, we came up a little bit shorter than we should have. And then the pieces kind of just fell into place in my third year. And my fourth year, we went back to nationals, and you have that pressure. And then we kind of got knocked down again, losing that first game. So there goes your chance, right, of going back to back. And okay, how do we still, recognize that we're in a pretty privileged position and can make a really great experience out of it? I think one of the hardest, but also one of my favorite years was my last year in my fifth year, because we had, I think, 10 first years. So that's probably a big element of why we were really successful, is we had a good core of veterans the year we won and the year after that. And then we kind of lost a lot. And so it was a tougher year, especially being captain and feeling like you have a big amount of weight on your shoulders and helping the team, and being relied upon. It was hard, trying to win, trying to pull things together, and bring the team back to where we were, or trying to at least. But the one thing that we did do is have a lot of fun together in that year. And so it's a really memorable year for me too, even though the results on the ice weren't maybe exactly, we didn't make the playoffs that year. But it gave me kind of a new experience on what leadership can look like when things aren't going the best way either too, right? And I learned a lot that year as well.
Yeah, so between kind of that experience of those really difficult and dark moments when you were kind of making that first second year transition, and then the leadership stuff kind of later as you wore a letter on your chest in your final years, did those kind of have an influence on what you chose to then do next? We're going to get into kind of the coaching aspect, the mental health counseling side. Were those kind of catalysts in making those decisions to start pursuing that kind of involvement with the sport after you finished playing?
Totally. Definitely the mental health side became an interest as I was transitioning over to U of M and what I experienced. And I saw a sport counselor, like someone at UConn that specifically worked with athletes. And I was like, that's pretty cool, that they can really narrow in on a demographic like that, and have that opportunity. And then I think as I kind of formed into a leadership role, and seeing that my favorite part of wearing that letter was being able to try and connect with my teammates, and wanting to be that person that they could come to if they had things going on outside of hockey, and not just trying to lead on the ice, but also trying to be that person that anyone felt like they could come and talk to, whether it was life, sports, school, whatever. And so that's when I really started to realize this passion that I have, kind of in this field of counseling.
What skills do you think that kind of you have as an individual that made it make sense for you to kind of go down this route? Like, is it, communication skills or passion, or just simply that lived experience? Like, what parts of kind of you and the package that you provide kind of made this the right fit for you?
Yeah, I think there could be a lot of different, like you just mentioned, skills. Kind of expanding on what I mentioned, I think just really caring about people outside of them as an athlete, because that's what I really wanted to feel when I was at UConn. And like, yes, I was doing well on the ice. And that was a big kind of key factor in trying to get me to stay of, look how good you're doing. Look at how we're doing with you. But the one thing that I think that I do well is connecting with people for who they are, right, outside of being an athlete. And that's been fun this year too. Now switching to the male side, because it is a bit of a challenge at the beginning for them to kind of let that guard down a little bit. But I think that's one of the biggest things. But then, it's so interconnected, like you said, of having played, now having this background, and then how I bring that into coaching too. And a lot of emotional regulation was a really great skill when you're coaching as well. And I know that there's a lot of stereotype and stigma around the upcoming, generation of being soft or entitled. Sometimes we hear, and it's something that I've really dove into in research and reading and just trying to have a better understanding. But you know, today's athletes, it's their whole life, it's their whole identity to be a player. And so they can't necessarily all the time separate the difference between constructive feedback being personal or not, right? It's not personal ever, but when your whole life revolves around it and you have a hard time relying on confidence away from the game, which I definitely did, then it's hard not to take things personally in how we're communicating. So I do think that's a big piece too. And that comes back to just being able to relate as well for me, because I experienced that too, where I really struggled to separate myself from being an athlete and who was I. And it's a decade later and I'm still learning who I am away from the sport of hockey and what makes me special outside of the game. And I think I just want to bring a lot of those tools back to today's kind of players.
Yeah, that's such an interesting kind of point, and something that I could probably talk about forever, the whole idea of the modern high performance athlete and like how young, kids are specializing and stuff like that. And you're totally right that it's so difficult to separate your experience with the sport from everything else in your life, because it is connected to everything else in your life. And so I think that kind of having that openness to want to meet people where they are, because there's so many people that are like you said, oh, the generation's so soft, so entitled, whatever. It's like, okay, so are you just not going to work with them then? So because if you're going to work with them, how are you going to get to know what their needs are, what their motivators are, how they communicate, how they work, and stuff like that. And so I think that kind of openness to get to know them as a generation in a current environment, but then also, like you said, on an individual level as well, I think is super important. I'm curious to know, I've always kind of wondered this about some people when they make the transition from being an athlete to working with athletes. I remember when I was younger watching these Winnipeg Jets videos. They used to do like these things called Q&As in the intermissions, and they were so cute, and they would ask all these questions. And one time, I was pretty young, I was probably like 12 or something, and one of the questions was who on the team would make the best coach, whatever. And so at that time, Blake Wheeler's on the team, Andrew Ladd's on the team, Dustin Bufflin's on the team, all these big guys who as the Jets 2.0 originators, whatever. You get this video, and every single one of them is like Jim Slater, Jim Slater, Jim Slater, Jim Slater. And if you don't know Winnipeg Jets hockey, that's like he was like a third line, fourth line center with the Jets, whatever, kind of and so I remember being kind of taken aback by that at the age of, 11, 12 or whatever it was, being like, what, really, that guy? But then you always think about, Wayne Gretzky tried to be an NHL coach and it didn't really go so well for him and stuff like that. Just because you're good at the thing doesn't mean you're good at coaching the thing, right? So I'm curious to know, kind of from your own experience in the high performance side, does it make it kind of easier to relate and get to connect with these individuals? Or do you also find that there may be sometimes certain biases? You're like, well, when I played this, or when I was working with this problem, this, and having kind of those own biases that can sometimes skew the way you're handling kind of a situation at present? Or does it kind of have a little bit of both every now and then?
Yeah, totally. And I think that is something that, especially for me, my last few years of coaching, I've worked with predominantly a very young staff. And so we're all kind of teetering on that edge of being like, can relate to, because we're probably just the start of those kind of generational stigmas, right? But then, yeah, now as I get a little bit, you start to see some things like, I didn't quite go through it that way. But I'm still finding that it is kind of similar in a lot of ways. And it's interesting how you mentioned like Jim Slater and things like that. And I don't know that I'm not sure if my teammates, they probably would think that I'd go into coaching because all I did was watch hockey. Like I was that kid on the bus home watching Jets games all the time. I watched all of my brother's hockey games. I would sit with the parents while the siblings were playing, and my mom and dad would nudge me to go, but I loved watching hockey. So I think, yes, I was kind of an offensive type of player, probably a bit of a liability in the D zone at times. And so, usually it is, like you said, maybe a third liner or someone like that that really gets a full understanding of the game that could transition to a role like that. But I think from watching so much, I was able to grasp a lot of different perspectives of the game. And yeah, so it's been interesting, but totally sometimes I can very much relate in a lot of ways. But I think what I love about my type of work too is I'm trained in a way to really zoom out when working with someone, right? Because when I'm in session with a client, I can't. It's actually probably sometimes harder when you do relate because, like you're saying, you have that bias. And we learn about that in our training so much on how do we recognize it? How do we have that self awareness that we're having these feelings? And how can we kind of acknowledge it and set it aside and not transfer that onto a client? And it's the same thing with coaching in a lot of ways. The more that I am diving into the counseling world, the more I'm seeing the similarities in so many ways with kind of what a modern coach, I guess, would be more like, not traditionally, but in a modern sense. So it's kind of something that I transfer over into when I'm coaching as well, too, of kind of like you said, meeting them where they're at, of like, and what we see on the bench can be totally different from what they see on the ice, right? And so I always try to take that approach of like, okay, what did you see there? Right. So I can get an idea because I might be all the way over here and their idea might be all the way over there. And then I come in hot and they are like, whoa, that's not what I thought. So once I hear the kind of their response, it's just getting them to think for themselves a little bit too when you're trying to communicate and not just tell them, well, you need to do this or you need to do that. It's okay, next time, like, what are some other options that you see in those moments? So certainly there are biases, but I do think that that's one of the beautiful things about counseling is that you're really trained to try and recognize. And as counselors, we go through a lot of our own self work, and a lot of programs mandate that you go to counseling before you graduate so that you can be in a place to support your clients and not have your own kind of feelings take over in certain moments.
No, for sure. And I want to kind of touch on the counseling stuff a bit more specifically, and then zoom it out to talk about the coaching as well, because I people talk about all the time. There are certain buzzwords and everything that get thrown around, and there's the whole idea of, we need to prioritize mental health. What does that actually look like kind of in practice for athletes? Because I think it's a very easy thing to say, and it's like, but what does that mean in terms of the actions that I can take or the observations that I can make and stuff like that? How do you kind of perceive that trend of trying to get more into the openness of talking about these things, and even like, yeah, words like destigmatizing and whatever? What does that look like in practice, and how is that something that you kind of work with your clients and your athletes on actually implementing in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, totally. Well, here's a good example. Friday, I did some team sessions with Interlake Female. So I work with their U13, U15, and U18 teams. And I know January is always a hard time of year. There's that myth that the third Monday of the month is the most depressing day of the year, Blue Monday. No actual evidence behind that, but it is something that floats around. However, I can relate to being an athlete in January where it's dark and it's cold and you're going through exams and you're in the thick of the season and there's pressures, right? And so we talked a lot about mental health in that session, and just I like to use the analogy of either your gas tank or your cups. So if we go with cups of with the girls we talked about, we have school, sport, because a lot of them play other sports, and then just your general personal. And how full are your cups right now? Like which one feels the most full? If it's sport that's overflowing, can we pour a little bit of that into maybe our personal or vice versa, or all these different things? And so it's just recognizing the balance, because I think that's what lacks so much in high performance today is, well, if you want to be the best, you have to do more than everybody else. And, you have to train this much harder and do the extra to get that 1% better. But I think what people miss sometimes is that 1% better or that extra can look a lot of different ways. And yeah, shooting 100 pucks a night can be great too, but also finding time to just like read a nice book that you enjoy can have a really big impact on how you're feeling too, and being able to disconnect, or putting your phone away for a while, which I know is such a big topic, right? Right now with technology, and a lot of times, and I talked a lot with the girls about how whenever we're feeling overwhelmed or distracted, or we need a distraction from an emotion or a thought, it's the first thing that we want to grab, right? And so I think with mental health in general throughout a season, it's just trying to manage your cups, right? Even your cups out a little bit, and bring that awareness to yourself of, okay, what do I need right now? And it's not that, well, I need to not go to practice tonight, but it's recognizing those small things, that you can incorporate into your day that can really help you to reset, and just bringing some awareness, to that too. And I know some people will be like, well, I do yoga for an hour in the morning and I meditate for this amount before night. And that's amazing. What's your intention behind that? Is it because we think just doing that is going to help us? Or what do you feel like you're getting out of those moments? Is it benefiting you? What do you notice the benefits are? Or are we, yeah, just doing it because we know that that's what mental health is supposed to look like, and good for you. So finding things that are really small, intentional things, for you in a day. And it's hard just finding a full day in a week to reset to. And so maybe it's just an evening, or a couple hours after practice where you can disconnect and find the things. The one thing that I just encourage the most is, who are you away from hockey, and what do you enjoy away from hockey? Like, what do you enjoy doing? And those are the two hardest questions. And it's not just with hockey. I work a lot with clients from an academic standpoint too, that just study 24/7, and that's all they're thinking about, is making sure that they're doing well, in school. And it's like, well, who are you away from your sport? And it's the hardest question. And so I think that's kind of the biggest direction that I go, is giving them a space to try and separate themselves from, yes, something that they love very much, but even the things that we love can be hard sometimes, right?
I think it's really interesting that kind of hearing a lot of this, because high performance athletes, I feel like oftentimes we are, it's easy enough for us to understand what that kind of looks like, because there's, gameplay environment and all this different stuff, but it applies to high performance people as well. Like you said, bringing up the academic example and stuff like that, where it's more of a mindset thing, and it looks different and manifests differently in different people depending on what the high performance environment is for them. But I think that, a lot of the folks that listen to this show tend to be a bit more on the kind of the career side of hockey, interested in, pursuing a next step of, getting involved in the sport or whatever. And something that was a New Year's resolution for me actually this year was to do one thing a week that I don't directly correlate with like a productive output, because that's something that I've been kind of going through, is that, I haven't read a fictional book in a long time, because I'm like, that's not helpful for my brain. If I'm going to actually put aside time to read, it has to be something that's going to help me learn more about hockey. It has to be something that's going to make me a better leader, all these different things. And so that was something that was kind of challenging for me, because so many things that I really liked growing up, playing musical instruments and writing books and, coloring, all these different things, I haven't done them in a really, really long time, because our hours in a day are finite. And so it's like, how can I get the most out of myself? And, personally, I've been able to kind of work around, gaslight myself into making sure I'm eating well and exercising and all this sort of stuff, because I'm like, it's going to make me more productive, but I haven't been able to find a workaround to get, playing music or something to get me to think it's going to make me smarter. So this is something that I've kind of been trying this year, because when you love something so much, it's very difficult to kind of want to separate yourself from it. And I sit down to, watch a movie, it's like, but I'm also going to have, Canva open on my phone to make some new graphics for my upcoming show to talk about the Winnipeg Jets fourth line, defensive metrics and everything. And it's because I want to do it, but sometimes it
Totally.
mentally exhausts you and stuff. And so that doesn't mean you're any less dedicated to the craft. It doesn't mean that you need to quit or leave or whatever, but kind of understanding who you are as a person outside of it, I think is super, super important. And it's probably much, much more difficult with athletes than it is with, some other areas of high performance in life, because the correlation between what you put in versus what you get out, you can calculate it in terms of wins and personal points and all these stats that you can actually track about yourself, whereas it's a little bit harder in like a professional environment or something. But with grades, if you get an A or if you don't get an A, it's very easy in black and white. And same thing with winning and losing a hockey game. And you've worked with now both kind of obviously on the mental health counseling side, tons of different people, but as a coach, you've kind of done the women's side of the game and now the men's side as well. And what have you found have been some of the most interesting parts of kind of working your passions and your, your educational qualifications of, being a mental health counselor into your experience as a coach, and getting your athletes to kind of value these similar things and work on those sorts of things, not as their counselor, but as their coach?
Yeah, totally. And there's been a lot more similarities than I thought there would be from the female side to the male side. Of course, there's some differences too, but I can't imagine the guys' thoughts at the beginning of a female and a therapist being their assistant coach. But like I said, I think that's one of my strengths, is being able to connect with people, and so and reading off of them, and kind of finding ways to build that relationship, and it's gone beautifully. But it's interesting how, a lot of times we think that the female game is emotional, right? Or that females are emotional. But I'm realizing how emotional, like, yes, maybe inwardly at times, this is a very general sense, not saying that's everyone, but when I think about myself, at least from that perspective, like I would struggle emotionally in terms of like sensitivity internally of managing, like trying not to cry in a situation, basically at hockey could be a very common one. But no one seems to acknowledge the fact how emotional the men's side really is, like the physicality, like aggressiveness or aggression is a form of emotion, right? The way
It's
that
like, how do we not call anger emotions? Because if anger is an emotion, men's hockey's pretty emotional, man.
the way that they chirp each other off the bench, that's emotion, right? And it's way worse. The girls, and it's one thing that I've actually noticed is a bit of a double standard, probably not intentionally, and a lot of referees might disagree with me on this, but I found that the leash was so much shorter for the girls and what they could say before they'd get a penalty versus what I've heard the guys, like just in terms of not so much what they're saying, but how long they let it go on for before something happens, or if the guys get really emotional at the ref compared to the girls. Or even me as a coach, I found last year, if I was getting fired up, I was getting teed up for something, which I've learned my lesson pretty quick as I've gotten into it. But yeah, that's one of the biggest things, is it's very emotional. How they treat each other is full of emotion. They're it's just displayed in a different way. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that I've tried to bring over, especially when you're on a young team like we are, and we're learning how to, play in different scenarios. We started the year where we were losing by large margins. And so you're not really focusing on the small little details of managing emotions in a game. You're trying not to let a team fold and crumble when you're in a position like that. But especially now down the stretch, as we found ourselves in close games, we always hear the phrase and the cliches of, yes, manage your emotions. What does that look like? Like, what do you mean by that? And that's something that I always try to bring in, whether it's from that side of it or also a coaching element of like, well, we need to score more goals. We need to be more physical. Those are great, but how do we break that down to the actual process of what that looks like? But yeah, from the counseling and mental performance side, kind of that mindset of resetting in between shifts. What does our self-talk look like? And our assistant Frizy is really good friends with Seth Jarvis, and he had such a great episode in Face Off and how self-deprecating he is and how he's working on it. And I thought it was awesome, because I think so many athletes can relate to that, and for him to be okay with sharing that and being vulnerable and what that looks like, because I hear it all the time on the bench, and I'm like, it's not gonna make you play any better, right? And the biggest thing that I try to share too is, you're not letting yourself off the hook. Like, yes, you miss an open net, it's okay to be upset about that, but how do we kind of bring ourselves back to neutral? I don't want you to, instead of saying I suck, and say I'm great and try and like fake it and say something positive just because you're supposed to. But how can we bring kind of neutral language in to focus on something more task oriented for your next shift of like, okay, that sucked. I didn't like that I did that, but what's my small win for the next shift? So I think that's the biggest thing that I've really tried to bring over from the female side to the male side, and just in general.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way to sort of look at it. And I really like kind of what you talked about. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and kind of the content creation that I do in and around hockey is the whole idea of speaking it in process, where it's like there are so many words that we use in terms of actual on ice outputs and stuff. Defensive defenseman. What does that look like in practice? And like, what does that mean in terms of, the behavior that a player has to exhibit in order to become said defensive defenseman and stuff like that? And we use so many terms and throw them around. And if you're just, a hockey fan or even, someone who works in media, it's not necessarily your job and responsibility. But if you're trying to kind of meet these athletes that you're talking about and working with, if you're going into a locker room to get to know them and trying to understand where they're at, like, you need to kind of speak in the language that makes sense to them, and get to know the realistic kind of baseline of where you're starting from and where you're at. And I'm curious to hear kind of on your side, are there any misconceptions that you feel like the average layman sort of has about, whether it's junior hockey players or, youth sport hockey players or just high performance athletes in general, where it's like, oh, they, take things too seriously, or, they're XYZ? Are there certain things that you feel like kind of on the front-facing consumer side that people maybe feel a certain way about, the general classification of high-performance athlete that isn't necessarily true from your kind of where you sit as someone who supports them in different ways?
Yeah, totally. I think there's so many different ones that you could come up with. And I think from the one that I think about the most when it comes to maybe in a sport, or you're at a level where, like, prior to there being, the PWHL, and people would always say, like, what's the point of putting all of this time and energy into something if you're not going to if you can't make a career out of it, or like it's just going to end after you're done. But from personal experience, what I see is like how much high competitive sport and just sport in general can mold you into who you are for the rest of your life. And I don't think that I'd be able to be where I am today if it wasn't for playing hockey and all the triumphs and successes that came along with it. And yeah, I think sometimes people are like, I just don't get why you would commit so much time to this, and it's just a waste of time. But you're building so much than just being an athlete, right? You're learning to overcome challenges, and obviously the classics of teamwork, and but like my ability to, resolve conflict and things like that too, right? When you're working in groups. And I used to hear it all the time from my coaches, like, one day when you're in your career, you're gonna face a time, and you kind of like roll your eyes, and it's true, right? And you get there, and it's all the case. So I always think it's amazing when people are so dedicated to their sports. Especially something like, I have a lot of clients that play ringette, and there's no opportunity to play university. You can play on a national team and things like that, but people don't always do it for that, right? They're not always doing it to try and become a professional. It's they love to compete, they love to push themselves, they love to get outside of their comfort zone. And so I think that can be a big one from kind of my experience now in junior. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and maybe not necessarily, but maybe general idea or stigmas around male hockey athletes. And I'm sure some are true, some are not. Some maybe have some isolated cases. But, a lot of times they're viewed as being very robotic, as I know Zane Perek said with Team Canada, or not showing that emotion like we talked about. But yeah, being on the male side now and seeing kind of this other side of athletes being more sensitive, and they do care about a lot more than just hockey, right? They have a lot of interests, such as friends and partners and family, and they can be very sensitive. And one of our guys works at a daycare before he comes to practice every day. He loves working with kids, and I think hockey's always been a sport where you always have to be portrayed very professional. Even when you watch walk-ins, for example, right, and how hockey players are dressed compared to maybe basketball, there's this overarching theme, like I said, Zane Perek too, of saying, like, you have to fit this very specific mold at times. And I think they're starting to break away from that, where you get to express yourself a little bit more authentically. But I think that can be a misconception, is that people sometimes put them in a box of being all the same, right? Oh, hockey guys are they don't care about anything else. They don't treat their friends well, or whatever it might be, right? There's lots of different things, but getting to know these guys as humans, right, outside of the sport, where maybe a lot of people don't always get that opportunity. And that's what I love about our league and the MJ, especially in the smaller communities, where they get to go out and have a lot of community involvement, and kind of show that side of themselves to other people. And then also being a female role model, I think, for these guys in some ways too, and bringing that kind of aspect in can be kind of very helpful for them too.
No, for sure. I think that kind of getting to know, like you said, the individual. I think, two things can be true at once. I think generalizations can sometimes be true when looking at, a sample of 100 nameless hockey players. You can say they tend to X, but, this one person, when you're looking at specifically Jake or Josh or whoever, if that person is different, then that person is different, and that's okay and that's cool. And how can we kind of work with that person and where they're at? And you made a comment about the sort of changes that we might be seeing to a certain degree in some of the areas. I think maybe kind of as my just last question to put a pin in kind of this whole conversation is, where do you kind of see this sport going, kind of from your experience of being so involved in it and having been involved in what I consider to be such kind of a pivotal time in terms of the, if you want to use COVID as an anchor, if you want to use kind of like Gen Z, whatever, as an anchor, there's a lot that's changed in the, hockey world in the last 10 years and everything. Where do you think kind of the next steps and stages and developments in the sport look like in terms of how individuals are able to kind of prioritize themselves and get to know themselves outside of the sport in order to be better in the sport in terms of, their mental health, and as well as, high performance hockey as a whole? What do you kind of see the next steps, the next evolutions in taking these next steps looking like?
Yeah, I mean, totally. There's lots of different directions. I think that today's athletes do a good job of advocating for themselves. And again, sometimes that gets misconstrued of being entitled or, whatnot. But I think it used to just be so authoritative in that you do what I say because I said it, but you don't necessarily understand the reason why or how that's benefiting you. And I think that we're going in this direction where they just want to know the why of what they're being asked so that they can buy into it, right? And the idea around like bag skating or whatever it is, right? There's so many different things that come up of you just do it because that's how it always had been, but it's like they're starting to question like, okay, well, what's the value in this at times, right? And I think that's where we're going to continue to go, where yes, there's still this authoritative kind of measure from a coach and an athlete, but there is a collaborative element too. And I learned that a lot from even the higher levels at the National Hockey League, and listening to Marty Johnston talk about a presentation, with regards to his power play. And he's very much working with them all together of what they see as well. And it's not just him and what he's telling them. He's like, they're all really high level athletes. Like they can share a lot too. And so I think that that's kind of where you'll see the direction continuing to go, is having a little bit more of a voice. And then that's gonna, but I also think that from a coach side too, you see a little bit more vulnerability that way as well, where we're not always afraid to share when we're going through a hard time too, or when something's bothering us, because traditionally you would just have a coach blow up on the bench, right? Or something like that. And then the players would think, oh, must have done something. But a lot of times they're frustrated about X, Y, and Z that aren't even related to the game, but that was just the trigger that, blew things up. So I think it's got to be more of a top down kind of approach, where when there are, the figures like us as coaches sharing some of the things that we've gone through, or when we can relate, then the athletes are going to be more willing to put themselves first too. And I think as a coach, you can always do more. And I learned that at U of M. I could be spending 24 hours a day doing things related to coaching, like you're saying, when you love something so much. But when I model what it's like to have boundaries, okay, do not text me after 5 p.m. unless it's an emergency. I will be answering the next day before practice, because we're all so accessible now, right? Oh, okay, well, Coach Jordy's taking the time to disconnect. I guess it's okay if I do too, right? And then they can kind of see that ripple effect of how you got to put yourself ahead of the things that you love sometimes too, to be the best that you can in it.
Yeah, I love that, because I think that something that's so important is that people sometimes think that if they become a little bit more vulnerable, it's going to cause someone to lose trust in them or whatever. But oftentimes it will make them kind of trust and respect you more if they, like you said, understand the why, get to know kind of how things work under the hood. You have more respect for, the engine of your car if you understand kind of all the different bits and pieces that come together to actually make it run. So I think that that's a really, great way to kind of end off this episode. I think it's been so interesting to hear all these different layers of your perspectives and how they kind of of come together to, you know, inform where you're at right now, the values that you hold, and how you kind of translate them into the roles that you hold. So Jordy, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. This was tons of fun. And everyone who's here listening, thank you so much for being here. And we will see you all next episode. Thanks, everyone.